Through the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program, you'll have the opportunity to develop learning experiences for students to ask questions and explore history through carefully examining historical sources. For example, let's look at a few primary sources that we can use to prompt discussions about barriers to literacy and literacy as an act of resistance or literacy as a project of freedom. So one image that we have access to from the Library of Congress is a photograph of Sojourner Truth, who we know was a fugitive slave, was very active in the women's movement, but also the abolitionist movement. One of the things that's important when looking at this image is not just that we have Sojourner Truth, with neatly clothed, but sitting with on the table to her left, we see a book that's there, right? But one of the things that becomes really important when interacting with these images is learning a little bit about, as much as we can, about the subjects that are being depicted, right, in these photographs. One thing that we know from so many of Sojourner Truth in her speeches is that she actually was technically illiterate, right? She could not read words and write her own narratives, but she produced lots of texts through the many speeches that she would give at various abolitionist meetings, and on the speaker circuit as someone bearing witness to her own experiences as an enslaved woman, and why she was as equal to any other woman in the world, right? Many people might be familiar with Sojourner Truth and the speech, "Ain't I a Woman," right? These are the kinds of texts that Sojourner Truth produced that we are able to kind of read to make sense of the experiences and the gendered politics of enslavement. But this question of literacy is very important because one of the things that I always like when, from Sojourner Truth is there's a quote from one of her speeches where she says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she says, "I can't read words or a spelling book, but I can read men and nations," right? So this idea that reading and literacy is not just about reading words on the page, but it's also about reading the world, right? Literacy is about reading words, but also reading the world. And Sojourner Truth really embodies this experience. And we also know from her history that when it came to corresponding with various people in the abolitionist movement or people who wrote her letters, she often relied on members of her family, particularly her grandsons, to respond to her letters, right? So this idea of her as a technically illiterate woman, but still interacting with the literate world is very important because we have to challenge this idea of only thinking about people who were technically literate, who were able to write their words down on the page during the kind of 19th century and during this earlier period in history as the only people that we can look to for intellectual ideas and for as evidence of intelligence. Obviously, Sojourner Truth was a very intelligent woman and had a lot of influence on literature that would be produced both during and after her time. But also that story of her grandsons helping her to interact with the literate world also demonstrates the communal value of literacy, how literacy was not just something in African American communities that was valuable to an individual person, right? It wasn't an anti-social endeavor, but we often see how enslaved people, but also people after slavery, use their literacy toward communal ends, right? Reading letters to people or reading newspapers or reading books to community members who may not have had the opportunity to become educated, formally educated themselves, right? This is a value of literacy that shows up not only in Sojourner Truth's narrative, but also this is the story of Carter G. Woodson, who's the person that founded Black History Month, who grew up having to read to his illiterate father from the newspaper, but also having to read to illiterate Civil War veterans and formerly enslaved men that he worked alongside in the coal mines, right? So this complexity to Black literacy is something that's reflected in Sojourner Truth's personal narrative, and is something that we can take as a resource for thinking about the politics surrounding literacy in African American culture more broadly.